In November 1927, on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a crew came to the corner of 57th Street to tear down a huge house. This was the biggest private home ever built in Manhattan. It had 130 rooms and took up an entire city block. It used to be the house of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, whose grandfather, the Commodore, created America's rail network. The huge house had been there for 45 years. It was like a French castle that someone had moved to American land. The walls were light gray stone with fancy carvings. Inside rooms were covered in gold and expensive marble. This home yelled about money so loud that people could hear it far away. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. Now the house was falling apart. Not because of fire or bad construction. No. It was falling because no one wished to keep it. The family could not pay the $30,000 yearly tax cost. The time when homes like this were possible was completely over. The Gilded Age started in the 1870s. At that time, money made from industry created a new group of rich Americans. These were railroad giants, steel kings, and oil bosses. These people built huge royal-like homes on Fifth Avenue. They wanted their homes to be as nice as any European kings. They had parties that cost thousands of dollars. They bought great art, had their daughters marry titled Europeans, and lived with a level of luxury most other Americans could not even dream of. But by the 1920s, this period was done. The huge houses were being torn down to make way for big stores and apartment complexes. The great wealth was now being taxed. The entire social structure that supported this way of life fell apart. It was hurt by the World War, new changes in law, and Americans changing ideas about what mattered. This tale is about how the Gilded Age finished. It was not one moment but many years of trouble from worker groups, reporters, government leaders, and real-world money problems. A world that was built on unequal wealth could not last once the poor people decided they were tired of it. If you like learning a lot about American history and buildings, please think about following our channel or joining as a special member. We look into the reasons that built and ruined America's best times and grandest homes. Let's start with the Wrecking Ball. Chapter 1. The day Cornelius Vanderbilt's palace fell. The Vanderbilt house covered the whole block between Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, between 57th and 58th Streets. It had 130 rooms spread out over many floors. By any measure, it was the biggest private home ever put up in New York City. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had it built in 1882. He was not the first Commodore Vanderbilt who made the money, but his grandson. By the time young Cornelius became an adult, the Vanderbilt name meant trains, and that meant more money than anyone could count. The house showed off that wealth. George Brown Post, one of New York's top builders, designed it. It cost over $3 million to construct, which is like over $90 million today. The outside looked like a French country castle, with light gray stone walls, steep roofs, and stone carving on every side. It seemed like something that had been moved right out of the Loire Valley in France. Inside was even more elaborate. A huge main room went up 3 floors with carved wood panels and colored glass windows. The ballroom could hold hundreds of guests. A library 2 stories high held rare books. The dining room sat dozens beneath golden ceilings. Every room tried to look better than the next with its marble, gold coating, fancy wood, and detailed art. Cornelius II died in 1899 at 55. People said it was from working too hard to manage the family's train business. His wife Alice kept living in the house. She looked after the mansion, the help, and the social duties that came with being a Vanderbilt. The parties, balls, and dinners all went on. The house remained a key spot in New York high society, but things were shifting. Even before the First World War, the costs of keeping up such homes became hard. Property taxes went up as the city valued these palaces at their real price. Staff wages increased because workers started asking for better pay. Heating, upkeep, and fixing things required constant spending. The war made the changes happen faster. There were fewer house workers around, making it almost impossible to keep large staffs. Young men who would have been footmen were fighting in France. Young women who would have been maids found factory work that paid better. The social life that centered on big, fancy parties began to feel old-fashioned or even wrong when so many people were dying overseas. Alice Vanderbilt stayed in the mansion until 1926. By then, she was in her 80s. The house had become too big for one elderly lady, even with the help. The neighborhood was also changing. Office buildings were taking the place of other grand homes. Fifth Avenue was becoming less about homes and more about business. When Alice passed away, her children had a choice: keep the house or sell it. The property taxes alone were $30,000 per year. Add heating, electric, basic care, and a small staff, and the yearly costs went over $100,000. To make those costs worthwhile, someone would need to live there. And living there meant hiring 30 to 50 houseworkers. That meant another $100,000 or more in yearly pay. No one in the family wanted that huge job. The younger Vanderbilts liked smaller houses or apartments that had modern comforts. They had big country homes for the weekends. They did not need a city palace that ate up money. The mansion was put up for sale. The price was $7 million for the land and building. No one wanted it as a private home. The spot was too valuable for that. This was top business land in the heart of Manhattan. Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury store, bought the property. They wanted the land. The building did not matter to them except that it had to be removed. In 1927, the crew arrived. They started at the top, taking off the roof tiles, then the upper floors, working their way down. They saved materials where they could, like the carved stone front, the marble fireplaces, and the wood panels. Some of it was saved and sold to collectors. Most of it went into the trash pile. New Yorkers watched the teardown with mixed feelings. Some were sad to lose a famous site. Others saw it as a necessary step forward. The house stood for a time that felt very far away. 45 years earlier, when it was built, America had no income tax, no rules for workers, and no limits on how rich the wealthy could become. That world was gone. The demolition took months. News stories covered it often. Photos showed the house slowly turning into rubble, the castle front with huge holes where the windows had been. Rooms inside were open to the sky, and the grand stairs led nowhere. Finally, there was just an empty space where one of America's grandest homes had stood. Bergdorf Goodman built a new store on the spot. It was Art Deco style, modern with smooth lines and large display windows. The new building spoke of different values: business over rich nobles, modern efficiency over the Gilded Age's waste, and access for shoppers instead of just for the rich few. The Vanderbilt house was not the first to fall. By 1927, many other grand homes on Fifth Avenue had already been torn down. But this one was the largest and held the most meaning. When the biggest house built by one of America's richest families could not last, it proved what many believed. The Gilded Age was truly finished. The question is why? What forces ruined a social and economic system that had seemed so strong just a few decades earlier? To understand the end, we need to know the start. How did the Gilded Age begin? What created a world where families like the Vanderbilts could build palaces while workers starved? The answer begins 50 years earlier, after America's most tragic war. Chapter 2. The Railroad and Steel Kings of the 1870s. The Civil War ended in April 1865. 4 years of fighting had killed over 600,000 men. The South was ruined. The North had won. But victory brought new questions. What kind of nation would America become? The answer arrived on train tracks. Before the war, America was a set of regional economies. The Northeast made goods. The South grew cotton. The West was mostly empty. Moving things between them was slow and costly. Canals helped, but they froze in winter. Roads were terrible. Moving goods any distance took weeks or months. The war changed that. Both sides used trains a lot for military needs. The North especially showed how trains could move troops and supplies faster than anyone thought possible. Generals who understood logistics won battles. Logistics meant trains. After the war, that military knowledge became a business chance. If trains could move armies, they could move anything. Grain, cattle, steel, coal, people. The country just needed tracks connecting every place to every other place. In 1869, something amazing happened. Two companies building from opposite sides met in Utah. The transcontinental line was complete. You could now travel from New York to San Francisco only by train. What had taken 6 months by wagon now took 6 days. The result was immediate and huge. Suddenly, the West was connected. Farmers could send wheat to eastern cities. Ranchers could send cattle to Chicago stockyards. Miners could move metal ore to processing plants. Towns grew quickly along the tracks. Empty fields became farmland. The country was no longer separate regions. It was one single market. Building all those lines needed a huge amount of money, more than any person could give. So companies sold stock and bonds to investors. Those investors became very rich when the project succeeded. Some individuals gained control of many rail companies, building networks that covered many states. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was the first to truly see what connecting rail lines meant. He started with steamships, making a fortune in shipping. In the 1860s, he moved into trains, not building new lines but buying old ones and joining them into a system. By the 1870s, Vanderbilt controlled the New York Central train line, which linked New York City to Chicago. He also controlled lines to Buffalo, Albany, and many other cities. His system moved goods and people more efficiently than smaller rivals. Efficiency meant profits. Profits made Vanderbilt one of the richest men in America. When he died in 1877, his wealth was thought to be over $100 million. In today's money, that's well over $2 billion, the biggest American fortune up to that time. He gave most of it to one son, William, who was even better at increasing the family money. But trains were just one chance. The growing rail network created demand for other industries. Tracks needed steel, a lot of it. Miles and miles of steel rails constantly wore out and needed replacing. Andrew Carnegie saw that chance, a Scottish immigrant who began as a telegraph operator. Carnegie worked his way up in train management. He learned how the business ran, what it needed, where the problems were. In the 1870s, he switched from transport to steelmaking. He built huge factories around Pittsburgh, facilities that used the newest method, the Bessemer process, which could make steel faster and cheaper than old ways. Carnegie's factories ran well, making huge amounts of steel at a lower cost than rivals. Carnegie didn't just make steel. He controlled every step of the process. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota. He bought coal mines in Pennsylvania. He bought ships to move the ore across the Great Lakes. He bought train lines to move materials to his factories. This vertical integration meant he didn't need anyone else. Every dollar that could be taken from the steel business stayed inside Carnegie's system. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel led American production. The company's profits were staggering. Carnegie himself was gathering wealth that matched Vanderbilt's. Then there was oil, a new industry that barely existed before the Civil War. In 1859, the first commercial oil well had been drilled in Pennsylvania. At first, oil meant kerosene for lamps, taking the place of expensive whale oil. That market alone was big. John D. Rockefeller understood something others missed. The money was not in drilling for oil. That was too risky. Wells often came up empty, or they produced too much and flooded the market, causing prices to crash. The money was in refining the oil and moving it. Rockefeller started Standard Oil in 1870. The company bought crude oil from drillers, turned it into kerosene, and sold it to distributors. Rockefeller made secret deals with rail companies for better shipping costs. He lowered prices below rivals until they went broke or sold out to him. He bought competing refineries, putting them into one massive business. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of American refining. It was a monopoly in every way. Rockefeller organized his holdings as a trust, a legal structure that let him control many companies while keeping them technically separate. The trust made Rockefeller the richest man in America, richer than Vanderbilt had been, richer than Carnegie. By some guesses, at his peak, Rockefeller's wealth was equal to over $400 billion in today's dollars, the richest American in history. These three men, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and others like them, created levels of wealth never seen before. The speed was amazing. Vanderbilt built his fortune in 2 decades. Carnegie in 1, Rockefeller even faster. They did it in a time with almost no rules. No income tax existed until 1913. No laws against monopolies until 1890. No labor laws protecting workers. No rules for workplace safety. No limits on working hours. Companies could do nearly whatever they wished. Workers had no protection. If you got hurt on the job, that was your problem. If you were fired, you had no recourse. If your wages were cut, you either accepted it or quit. No job meant total poverty. There was no safety net, no public assistance, no unemployment pay. You worked or you starved. This combination, massive industrial growth plus zero rules, created fortunes faster than any time before. But it also created unequal wealth on a scale America had never known. The top 1% owned more than the bottom 90% combined. The rich lived in palaces. The poor lived in tiny, crowded buildings without proper heat or plumbing. The name robber baron was created to describe these industry leaders. Critics argued they had stolen their fortunes through monopoly, dishonesty, and using workers unfairly. Defenders called them captains of industry, arguing they had built the systems that made America an economic powerhouse. Both descriptions held truth. These men had built train networks, steel mills, and oil refineries that completely changed the country. American industrial output grew quickly. Cities grew. Living standards improved for many. But the benefits were not shared equally, very unequally. The men at the top piled up wealth beyond measure while workers struggled. And those men at the top needed a place to live, a place that loudly showed their success, a place that set them apart from ordinary people. They needed huge houses, and Fifth Avenue in New York City became the place to build them. Chapter 3. Mrs. Astor builds a world. Money alone didn't get you into Gilded Age high society. The Vanderbilts learned that the hard way when William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's son, tried to enter New York's top circles in the 1870s. He found doors closed. His family had $100 million. They owned train lines. They held huge economic power. None of it mattered. Old New York families saw the Vanderbilts as new money, common. The Commodore had started as a ferryboat operator. That smell of work, of trade, of getting your hands dirty never fully went away. The Vanderbilts needed someone to make them acceptable. Someone who controlled who got into the upper levels. Someone whose approval meant success. That someone was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, as she was always called, came from old New York wealth. The Schermerhorns had been successful since colonial times. Land, trade, banking, the respectable kinds of fortunes that grew slowly over time. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she joined another well-known family. The Astors had made their money in fur trading and New York land. They were old enough to be respected and rich enough to be powerful. By the 1870s, Caroline decided someone needed to set the rules for New York's elite. Too many new millionaires were showing up. Railroad money, oil money, steel money. All that new wealth threatened to overwhelm the old families. Without gatekeepers, anyone with money could claim a top spot. She named herself the gatekeeper, and she got help. Ward McAllister was a Southerner who had made money in California and retired to New York with big social goals. He had good taste, experience traveling in Europe, and time to spend planning big, fancy parties. He became Caroline's helper, advisor, and enforcer. Together they created a system, rules, a way to separate the acceptable from the unacceptable. First came the idea of the 400. McAllister supposedly created the term in 1888, though Caroline had been using the idea for years. The idea was simple. New York's inner circle was made up of exactly 400 people, no more. That number supposedly matched the size of her ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue. The actual number was just a random choice. What mattered was keeping people out. By saying membership was a fixed number, Caroline and McAllister made being included very important. If only 400 people truly mattered. Being one of those 400 meant everything. How did one get in? Caroline decided, period. There was no application process, no set criteria. She simply figured out who belonged and who didn't. Her approval granted access. Her disapproval meant being left out forever. Old money families were automatically included. The Livingstons, the Stuyvesants, the Rhinelanders, families who had been wealthy since before the American Revolution. That gave her a base of perhaps 50 to 75 families she thought were rightful. The remaining spots went to new money families who proved they were acceptable. Proving yourself meant showing the right behavior for a long time. It meant having the right connections, the right marriages, the right taste, and most importantly, it meant Caroline liking you. The Vanderbilts, despite their wealth, struggled for years. The Commodore was too rough, too openly involved in business, too willing to fight rivals in public. Caroline found him crude. His son William was more refined, but still linked to trade. Not until William's wife, Alva, forced the issue did the Vanderbilts get in. In 1883, Alva threw a costume ball that was so elaborate, so costly, so hugely excessive that Caroline could not ignore it. The ball cost over $200,000, the same as over $6 million today. 200 guests, fancy outfits. The house was decorated from top to bottom. It was a statement. The Vanderbilts had arrived. Whether Caroline liked it or not, she attended. Once she accepted the Vanderbilts, others followed. The family was finally made acceptable. This system needed constant care. Caroline held regular parties during the season, which ran from November through early spring. She hosted dinners. She went to the opera in her permanent box. She spent her summers in Newport, Rhode Island, where she was in charge at her large summer home, Beechwood. The season worked on a strict calendar. Monday was opera night. Everyone who mattered went to the Metropolitan Opera, not just to hear music, but to be seen. Boxes were arranged by status. Caroline's box was in the center, first tier, the best spot. From there she could watch the whole room, noting who came and with whom. Calling cards were key. Ladies left cards when visiting. Not being home meant leaving your card on a silver tray the butler held. The cards themselves sent messages. A turned-down corner meant you had called in person rather than having your footman leave it. Different days were set aside for receiving calls. Tuesday might be Caroline's at-home day. Calling on Tuesday meant she would see you. Calling on Wednesday meant she would not. Young women made their official entrance at carefully planned balls. These debutante presentations introduced daughters to the top group, marking them as ready for marriage. The most important events happened at Caroline's balls. Being invited meant your family had arrived. Not being invited meant you did not exist. Men had slightly different rules. Business success alone was not enough. You needed to belong to the right clubs: the Union Club, the Metropolitan Club, the Knickerbocker Club. These clubs offered places where rich men gathered, made deals, and strengthened friendships. Membership required being sponsored by existing members. One negative vote could keep you out forever. The whole system was meant to stop social climbing. Caroline and her circle wanted to keep their place at the top. By making elaborate rules and rituals, by making acceptance require her personal stamp of approval, she made sure that new money could not just buy their way in. They had to be granted entry, but the system had weak spots. It needed new money to care about being accepted. The first generation of robber barons often did not care. The Commodore Vanderbilt reportedly didn't care what Caroline thought. He had money and power. That was enough. The second generation cared more. William Vanderbilt, and especially his wife Alva, wanted to be accepted. Their children would marry into the established families. Social position mattered for business ties, for marriage chances, for how the family was viewed. The third generation cared the most. By the 1890s and 1900s, young Vanderbilts, Astors, and other rich heirs grew up believing they belonged at the top. They had never known anything else. The structure felt natural and forever. Caroline kept her role until her death in 1907. By then she was old, often confused, but still seen as the person who decided what was stylish. After her death, others tried to take her place. None fully succeeded. The world broke into pieces. Many women claimed authority. The rules became less strict. But during her best years, about 1875 to 1900, she held power that money alone could not buy. She decided who mattered. And the wealthy families building mansions on Fifth Avenue all wanted her approval. Those houses were statements, declarations of wealth and taste, attempts to prove their worth. Fifth Avenue became the stage where those declarations played out. Chapter 4. Fifth Avenue becomes Gold Coast. In 1870, Fifth Avenue above 50th Street was mostly empty. A few brownstone houses, some empty lots, trees, quiet, almost suburban. The popular home area was further downtown around Washington Square. 20 years later, everything had changed. The stretch from 50th Street to 90th had become the most expensive residential land in America. Block after block of limestone palaces, French castles, Italian Renaissance homes, huge fancy designs, each one bigger and more elaborate than the last. This was Vanderbilt Row, Carnegie Hill, Millionaire's Mile, the physical proof of Gilded Age wealth, and it went up with amazing speed. The change started with the Vanderbilts. William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's son, began it in 1879. He ordered a massive brownstone house at 5th Avenue and 51st Street. Not happy with one house, he built 3 connected homes, one for himself and his wife, one for each of his 2 daughters. The whole complex cost nearly $2 million, but brownstone already felt old-fashioned. The really stylish material was limestone, white, elegant, more European, and the stylish look was French, specifically the castles of the Loire Valley. Never mind that French nobles built those castles over centuries. American millionaires wanted them now. Built in 2 years. Richard Morris Hunt became the architect of choice. He had studied in Paris, the first American to do so. He knew French building styles well. More importantly, he understood his clients. They wanted grandeur. They wanted to impress. They wanted houses that announced wealth from far away. Hunt delivered. In 1883, he designed a house for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva. The house went up on 5th Avenue at 52nd Street, right across from William Henry Vanderbilt's brownstones. It was French Gothic, gray limestone, steep roofs with carving everywhere. Inside were medieval wall hangings, colored glass, carved wood panels brought over from European estates. The house cost $3 million. Another $2 million went to decorating it. The Vanderbilt chateau set the pattern. Suddenly, every millionaire wanted a French palace or an Italian villa, or anything European, anything that suggested centuries of noble background, even if the fortune was less than a decade old. The building race quickly grew bigger. If the Vanderbilts built at 52nd Street, the Astors would build bigger at 65th. If Carnegie ordered a house at 91st, someone else would go even further uptown. Each mansion tried to outdo its neighbors. Andrew Carnegie built his house between 90th and 91st Streets in 1899. He had looked at the other houses carefully and decided they were all too showy. His would be simpler, elegant, refined. It still cost over $1 million and took up an entire block face. Simple was relative. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's business partner and later rival, built further downtown at 70th Street. His house was planned to eventually become a museum. Frick was already collecting old master paintings. He wanted a house that showed them off properly. Classical building style, large display rooms, perfect lighting. The house opened in 1914, just as the era was ending. The Astors built many houses. Caroline Astor's home was relatively small compared to later palaces. Her son built larger. Her nephews built larger still. The family owned land all up and down 5th Avenue. Astor money made in New York land bought New York land, which increased in value, making more money to buy more land. Senator William Andrews Clark, who made a fortune in Montana copper mining, built perhaps the most excessive mansion of all. 121 rooms, 4 art rooms, many ballrooms. It cost $7 million and took 7 years to finish in 1911. Critics called it vulgar. Clark did not care. He had money and wanted everyone to know it. The building boom created many jobs for architects, builders, decorators, and craftsmen. European companies sent marble by the shipload. Italian artists came to carve stone details. French decorators installed panels and furniture. The houses became showcases for imported luxury. Building one of these palaces was not fast. 2 to 4 years was typical. During construction, neighbors had to put up with constant noise. Stone cutting, hammering, wagons delivering materials. The disruption was huge, but no one complained too loudly. Everyone on 5th Avenue was either building or planning to build. The houses competed in details. Whose ballroom was largest? Whose marble staircase was most impressive? Whose art collection was most valuable? The rich owners treated their homes like museums, giving tours to special guests, showing off their latest buys, and the staffing needs were staggering. A house with 30 to 50 rooms needed 20 to 40 houseworkers at minimum. A butler, a housekeeper, a cook, multiple footmen, multiple maids, kitchen staff, drivers for the cars, grooms for the horses, and groundskeepers for any gardens. The houseworkers lived in the top floors. These were narrow rooms, plainly furnished, totally separate from the lavish spaces below. Staff used separate stairs. They were not supposed to be seen unless actively working. The system required constant management. The housekeeper watched over the female staff. The butler watched over the male staff. Everyone answered to the lady of the house who oversaw the whole operation. The costs went beyond building and staffing. Property taxes went up as the city valued these palaces at their true worth. Insurance was costly. Heating costs in winter were enormous. These houses had dozens of fireplaces plus early central heating systems that burned coal by the ton. Upkeep was constant. Roofs leaked. Stone cracked. Interior decoration needed updating every few years to stay stylish. But for 2 decades, roughly 1885 to 1905, the building continued. More houses, larger houses, more elaborate houses. 5th Avenue became a canyon of wealth. Walking up the avenue meant passing palace after palace, each one announcing its owner's fortune. The concentration of wealth in such a small area was unprecedented. Within 20 blocks lived families worth hundreds of millions combined. They went to the same parties. Their children married each other. They sat on the same company boards. They shaped American business and finance from their Fifth Avenue living rooms. The street became a tourist attraction. People would walk or take streetcars up Fifth Avenue just to stare at the houses. On Sunday afternoons, the sidewalks filled with middle-class families staring at houses they could never afford. The rich residents ignored them or resented the intrusion but could not stop it. These were private homes on public streets, and the whole display relied on a system that seemed permanent. The rich would stay rich. Their children would inherit and keep these houses. The mansions would stand for generations like European palaces. No one building these houses in the 1890s imagined that within 30 years, most would be torn down. No one thought the system could crash, but forces were already building that would destroy everything they had created. And those forces were gathering in places the Fifth Avenue residents rarely saw. In factories, in crowded city housing, in newspapers, in political movements. The pushback against Gilded Age waste was coming. It just hadn't arrived yet. Chapter 5. Inside a Gilded Age ball. The invitation got there weeks ahead of time. Heavy cardstock, engraved writing, your name written in fancy script, the date, the time, the address, and the unspoken rule that you had to attend. Saying no to a major ball invitation without a great reason was unthinkable. These events were not just parties. They were where reputations were made or ruined, where marriages were set up, where business deals were formed, where the social order was shown and strengthened. Getting ready for a ball took days. For women especially, every tiny detail mattered. The dress had to be new, or at least not worn to any recent party these same people had seen. It had to be stylish but not too bold, expensive but not overly showy. The dress alone might cost several $1,000s, equal to a factory worker's year's pay. Then there were jewels. Diamonds were essential, plus emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. The wealthiest women wore fortunes around their necks, tiaras, necklaces, bracelets, rings. The jewelry served two purposes: showing wealth clearly, but also as a kind of portable bank account. If financial disaster struck, the jewels could be sold. Many families survived temporary setbacks by quietly selling their gems. Hair required hours of work. Ladies' maids used curling irons heated over gas flames. They set up elaborate hairstyles, pinned in jeweled combs, and added false hairpieces if needed. The goal was height and volume. Hair piled high made women look taller and more queenly. Men had it easier. Evening clothes were standard. Black tailcoat, white vest, white bow tie, white gloves, shiny leather shoes. The uniform look was intentional. Men were not supposed to compete in clothes. Their wealth showed through their wives' and daughters' appearance. Carriages started arriving around 9 or 10 in the evening. Arriving too early risked looking too eager. Arriving too late risked missing important parts. The timing needed careful thought. The entrance to a major mansion on ball night was spectacular. Awnings stretched from the curb to the entrance. A red carpet covered the sidewalk. Footmen in uniform stood at attention. Police kept back the curious people who gathered to watch the wealthy arrive. Inside, the transformation was complete. Houseworkers had spent days getting ready. Every room on the ground floor was opened for the event. Furniture was taken out or pushed against walls. Thousands of flowers filled every space: roses, orchids, lilies, palms. The flowers alone might cost $10,000, gone and wilted by morning. Lighting was key. Gas lights or early electric lights blazed. Candles and candelabras added warmth. The goal was brilliant light. These events happened at night but were supposed to feel like daylight. Bright enough to see everyone clearly. Bright enough that jewels sparkled. Bright enough that no shadows offered escape from being watched. The host and hostess greeted guests in the main hall. Guests passed through a receiving line. Handshakes, quick hellos, names announced by the butler. This moment showed who was invited, who came, who belonged. Being in that line meant acceptance. Music played from the moment guests arrived. A full orchestra was usually placed in a balcony where they could be heard but not seen. Waltzes, polkas. Later in the evening, the new exciting dances from Europe. Older guests disapproved, but younger people insisted. Dancing began formally. Older married couples first, then younger married people. Finally, unmarried young women with suitable partners. The order mattered. Dancing out of sequence suggested disrespect for the rules. Young women came to balls to be seen by potential husbands. Their mothers watched closely. noting which men asked their daughters to dance. Too many dances with one man suggested an inappropriate attachment. Too few total suggested unpopularity. The ideal was steady attention from several suitable male partners. Men used balls to judge marriage prospects. Dancing gave a chance for conversation. You could check a woman's intelligence, personality, and interests. You could judge how a woman carried herself, how she interacted with others. And, of course, you could judge her family's wealth and connections. Between dances, guests moved around. They visited different rooms, admired the art and furniture, gossiped, and made observations. Every conversation was calculated. Who you spoke with mattered. Being seen talking seriously with important people suggested you were important too. Around midnight, supper was served, not a seated meal. A buffet in the dining room and nearby spaces. Tables loaded with food, hot dishes, cold dishes, elaborate arrangements meant to impress. Whole pheasants, salmon, lobster, oysters, caviar, and champagne flowing constantly. The food alone might cost $20,000. Guests ate standing or seated in small groups. The casual feel was intentional. It encouraged mixing. People could move between groups, start conversations, and make connections. This was when business was actually talked about. When parents set up meetings between their children, when alliances formed. Supper lasted an hour or more. Then dancing started again. The pace increased. The rules relaxed slightly. As the night went on and the champagne took effect, the mood loosened. Never scandalously, but enough that laughter came easier. Conversation flowed faster. The ball did not end at a set time. Guests left when they were ready. The host and hostess stayed until the last guest left, which might be 3 or 4 in the morning. Houseworkers stayed later, still cleaning, clearing dishes, removing flowers, and putting furniture back. They might work until dawn. The next day, newspapers covered major balls. Society pages listed attendees, described dresses, and noted who danced with whom. These reports were read eagerly. Being mentioned meant you mattered. Being ignored meant you didn't. The costs of throwing such an event were staggering. A major ball easily cost $50,000 to $100,000. Flowers, food, houseworkers, music, decorations. That is the same as $2 million to $4 million today for one evening of fun that would be forgotten within a week. But these events were not really about fun. They were displays of power, demonstrations of wealth, chances to strengthen the social order. Every element, the invitations, the flowers, the food, the music, served to show that the host could afford it and the guests deserved to be there, and the frequency was remarkable. During the season, a major ball happened nearly every week. Many smaller events happened constantly. Dinners, receptions, opera nights. The wealthy class spent months every year doing essentially nothing but entertaining each other. This lifestyle required enormous resources. Time, money, staff, energy. And it required that you never question whether it was worth it. The system worked as long as everyone agreed it mattered. Once people started asking whether fancy balls served any purpose, the whole structure became vulnerable. By the early 1900s, some voices were already questioning. Progressive reformers pointed out the difference. One ball cost more than a factory worker earned in a lifetime. The same families throwing $100,000 parties employed workers at very low wages. The criticism hurt. Some wealthy hosts became defensive. Others became more discreet. A few began to question their own way of life. But mostly the balls continued because stopping meant admitting the critics were right. And the Gilded Age elite were not ready for that admission. Not yet. Chapter 6. The servant army below stairs. A Gilded Age mansion didn't run itself. Behind every elegant ball, every formal dinner, every perfectly kept home stood an army of workers laboring constantly. The numbers were staggering. A typical Fifth Avenue house needed 30 to 50 staff members. Larger homes employed 70 or more. The Vanderbilt summer home in Newport, a 70-room house, kept a permanent crew of 40. And that did not include temporary hires for special events. The hierarchy below stairs was as strict as the one above. At the top sat the butler. He watched over all male employees, managed the wine cellar, supervised formal service, and acted as the master's personal helper. A good butler earned $1,200 to $2,000 annually, a large salary for the time, showing the job's importance. The housekeeper ranked equally high but supervised the female staff. She managed linens, oversaw cleaning, handled house finances, and made sure everything ran smoothly. Her pay matched the butler's. Together, they formed the management layer that kept the household operating. Below them came specialized positions. The cook ran the kitchen like a military operation. She might have 2 or 3 assistants plus dishwashers. In wealthy homes, the cook was often French, hired specifically because French food carried prestige. These professionals earned high salaries and often had strong personalities. Ladies' maids served the mistress and adult daughters. They did hair, maintained clothes, packed for travel, and provided personal service. This was skilled work requiring training. A lady's maid needed to know current styles, understand fabrics, style hair elaborately, and keep family matters secret. Valets did similar work for the master and adult sons. They kept clothes in order, laid out outfits, drew baths, and shaved their employers if required. The job needed knowledge of men's fashion and complete reliability. Footmen were young men in uniform who served at the table, answered doors, and gave general help. They were chosen partly for their looks. Height mattered. Being handsome helped. They wore fancy uniforms meant to impress visitors. Their work was visible, making them part of the display. Maids were split into groups. Parlor maids cleaned public rooms, keeping up the showpiece spaces guests saw. Bedroom maids handled private chambers. Kitchen maids worked under the cook. Laundry maids, often several women, tackled huge piles of washing in basement rooms. Each group had its own duties and rank. Below everyone came the scullery workers, dishwashers. They scrubbed pots, cleaned floors, and performed the dirtiest tasks no one else would touch. Usually young girls, often recent immigrants, they earned perhaps $3 weekly. They slept in tiny attic rooms, worked 16-hour days, and dreamed of moving up to better jobs. The labor was nonstop. A housemaid's day began around 6 in the morning. Light fires in fireplaces throughout the house. Empty chamber pots. Bring hot water for washing. Prepare breakfast. Serve breakfast. Clear breakfast. Clean public rooms before the family woke and came downstairs, all while remaining invisible. Houseworkers were trained to blend into the background. If the family noticed you, you had failed. After morning duties came lunch preparation and service, then afternoon tasks, then dinner preparation. Formal dinners required elaborate service, multiple courses, perfect timing, coordinated serving. The butler directed everything like a conductor. One mistake, one spilled drop, one clumsy moment could result in being fired. After dinner came cleaning, washing dishes by hand, scrubbing pots, putting away silver, cleaning the dining room, preparing for the next day. Kitchen staff might labor until 11 at night or later, then up again at 6 the next morning. One day off monthly was standard. Some employers allowed less. That day off usually meant Sunday afternoon and evening. Not enough time to go far or do much, just enough to attend church, write letters home, and rest before returning to work. Living conditions varied. The best employers provided decent rooms, enough food, and treated their people with respect. Others crammed houseworkers into unheated attics, fed them scraps, and worked them mercilessly. Employees had no defense. Employment was at will. You could be fired instantly without reason or references. No job meant no income. No income meant potential homelessness. The work was also dangerous. Kitchens were hot. Fires burned constantly. Heavy pots caused burns. Knives cut. Laundries used harsh chemicals. Falls from ladders while cleaning upper windows killed or injured people regularly. No workers' compensation existed. If you got hurt, you were dismissed and replaced. The wages seemed low by modern standards but made sense in context. Board and room were included. Houseworkers didn't pay rent, buy food, or buy work clothes. Their wages were money that could be saved or sent to family. Many immigrant workers supported relatives back in Europe with their earnings. Still, the unequal state was obvious. A lady's maid earning $400 annually dressed a woman who spent more than that on a single ball gown. Footmen earning $300 yearly served dinners where the wine alone cost more than they made monthly. The difference was visible daily, impossible to ignore. Some employers treated staff well. They gave gifts at Christmas, bonuses for long service, and medical care when people fell ill. These actions created loyalty. Workers who felt appreciated stayed for decades, becoming part of the family in a limited way. Other employers were cruel. They cut wages for minor mistakes. They banned boyfriends or girlfriends, meaning Household staff could not have romantic lives. They fired pregnant maids without references, making sure they would never find jobs in respectable homes again. The power difference was total. Young women faced particular dangers. Unwanted advances from men of the house or their guests were common. Refusing could mean dismissal. Accepting could mean pregnancy and ruin. Some employers blamed the maids anyway, saying that houseworkers must have been tempting. The victims had no protection, no one to speak for them, no justice. Labor organizing among household workers was nearly impossible. They lived with their employers. They worked alone, not in groups. They were easily replaced. Unions focused on factory employees and miners, people who labored together. Domestic workers remained isolated and vulnerable. By the early 1900s, the supply of household help was falling. Young women found other options. Factory work paid less but offered more freedom. You could leave at the end of your shift, live alone, and have privacy. Even with lower wages, many preferred factory work to house service. The wealthy families noticed. Finding good help became hard. Training new people constantly was tiring. Wages had to increase to attract workers. The economics of keeping huge staffs grew challenging. World War I made the change happen faster. Young men went to war. Young women took factory jobs supporting the war effort. Domestic service came to seem old-fashioned, a relic of European nobles, not modern America. The shortage made maintaining the mansions harder. Running a 50-room house with half the needed staff was impossible. Standards dropped and the costs kept rising even as service quality fell. This created pressure on the whole system. The mansions needed people to function. Without enough help, they became burdens rather than showpieces. The wealthy families who had built these palaces, assuming labor would always be available, found themselves trapped in houses they could not properly maintain. And the workers themselves, who had made the whole Gilded Age lifestyle possible, were walking away, finding better choices, and refusing to accept the old terms. Their quiet rebellion was helping to tear down the system from the inside. Chapter 7. European Envy and Art Collecting. American millionaires had a problem. They were richer than European nobles. Their houses were bigger than European palaces, but no one mistook them for royalty. They were new, raw, commercial. They made money in steel mills and oil refineries. European nobles inherited estates and titles going back centuries. The Americans wanted respect, cultural respect. They wanted to be seen as refined patrons, not just crude businessmen. So they turned to the one thing that could bridge the gap: acquiring masterpieces, specifically old masters. Renaissance paintings, medieval wall hangings, ancient sculptures, the kind of cultural items that came with centuries of history. If you couldn't inherit a noble history, you could buy one, or at least buy the things that suggested one. The timing was perfect for both sides. European nobility had treasures but needed cash. American millionaires had cash but needed cultural standing. A market across the Atlantic developed quickly in the 1880s and 90s. British nobles sold first. The farm slump of the 1870s had ruined their rental incomes. Estates that had supported families for generations suddenly could not cover expenses. Paintings hanging in country houses for 200 years went to auction. American buyers snapped them up. J.P. Morgan led the way. The banker gathered one of the greatest private collections in history. He bought entire estate's contents at once. Dealers would show him catalogs. Morgan would circle what he wanted, sometimes whole pages. The purchases would be crated and shipped to New York or his London home. Morgan acquired everything: paintings, old books, Chinese porcelain, Egyptian antiquities, medieval religious objects, Renaissance bronze statues. If it was old, valuable, and culturally important, Morgan wanted it. His holdings eventually filled multiple warehouses. Much of it he never even saw. He just owned it. Henry Clay Frick took a more focused path. He wanted old master paintings exclusively: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Velázquez. He built his Fifth Avenue mansion specifically to display them correctly. Large galleries, perfect lighting, climate control. The house was really a private museum that Frick happened to live in. Frick paid astonishing prices. In 1911, he bought a Rembrandt portrait for $500,000, equal to over $15 million today for one canvas. He thought it was a bargain. Great works only increased in value, and owning a Rembrandt meant something. It announced taste, sophistication, and cultural authority. The Vanderbilts also acquired pieces, though less systematically than Morgan or Frick. They bought French furniture, woven wall hangings, Italian Renaissance sculptures, whatever dealers convinced them they needed. Their houses became museums of European decorative arts, imported wholesale and installed in American homes. William Randolph Hearst took acquiring to the extreme. He bought entire European rooms, wood panels ripped from French castles, ceilings from Italian palaces. He would have them taken apart, shipped to America, and put back together in his properties. If he liked a fireplace in a Spanish monastery, he would buy the monastery, take what he wanted, and leave the rest. The dealers who helped with these transactions became wealthy themselves. Joseph Duveen dominated the trade. A British dealer with excellent connections, he understood both sides perfectly. He knew which families needed money. He knew which American millionaires wanted prestige. He brought them together, taking substantial commissions. Duveen was also a master salesman. He convinced American patrons that certain artists mattered more than others. He promoted Rembrandt heavily, Dutch masters generally, and Italian Renaissance works. He downplayed artists whose work was harder to sell. His influence shaped what American galleries looked like. The scale of the transatlantic transfer was enormous. Between 1870 and 1914, thousands of important pieces left Europe for America. The Louvre and National Gallery lost nothing, but private estates were emptied. Works that had hung in English manor houses for centuries ended up in Fifth Avenue mansions. Europeans had mixed feelings. The sales brought needed capital, but they also represented a cultural loss. National treasures leaving the country, heritage sold to American industrialists. Some criticized nobles for selling their birthright for cash, but the nobles needed the money. Keeping the paintings meant losing the estate entirely. American museum directors also benefited. J.P. Morgan left much of his holdings to the Metropolitan Museum. Frick's entire house and contents became a museum after his death. Other wealthy patrons made similar arrangements. American institutions acquired European masterpieces without having to negotiate with foreign governments. But buying paintings did not automatically bring sophistication. Critics, especially from abroad, mocked the Americans. They pointed out that purchasing culture was not the same as creating culture. The Americans were gathering objects, not truly understanding them. They were buyers, not experts. Some criticism was fair. American millionaires did buy things without really understanding them. They relied on dealers' advice. They bought for status more than true appreciation. A few were genuinely knowledgeable, but many simply wanted impressive display rooms. Isabella Stewart Gardner was an exception. A Bostonian, she built a Venetian palace in Boston specifically for her treasures. But unlike many wealthy patrons, she understood painting and sculpture deeply. She studied. She traveled widely. She befriended artists and scholars. Her holdings showed genuine passion, not just wealth. The competition between buyers drove prices higher. When multiple millionaires wanted the same Rembrandt, bidding could reach absurd levels. Dealers encouraged this. They would hint that another patron was interested. They would create artificial scarcity. The Americans, determined not to be outdone, paid whatever was asked. By the early 1900s, the best European masterpieces were increasingly in American hands. This was a massive cultural shift. For centuries, great paintings had stayed in Europe. Now they were crossing the Atlantic in huge numbers. Museums worldwide noticed. American institutions were becoming major centers. The practice also created duties. If you owned important pieces, you were expected to share them eventually through museum donations or by opening your home to scholars. The Gilded Age patrons largely accepted this. They saw themselves as caretakers, not just owners. The canvases would outlast them. Their legacy would be making them available. But the First World War changed everything. Suddenly, buying from Europe felt different. American soldiers were fighting there. The cultural exchange that had seemed sophisticated now felt complicated. Should Americans be buying treasures from countries they were defending militarily? After the war, the market continued, but the context had shifted. The American millionaires who had built the great galleries were aging or dying. Their heirs often were not interested in keeping huge collections. The assemblages began breaking apart. Museums acquired pieces, some returned to Europe. The concentrated private galleries of the Gilded Age started spreading out. and the whole endeavor revealed something key about Gilded Age wealth. These men could buy anything except the one thing they really wanted: legitimacy, cultural authority, the respect that comes from centuries of refinement. They could own Rembrandt, but they couldn't change the fact that their money came from oil wells and steel mills. They remained American businessmen who had gotten very rich. The purchases couldn't turn them into something else, but the paintings could outlast them. The works they bought still hang in American museums. The collections they assembled still benefit the public. Their money is gone. Their mansions are torn down, but the canvases remain. In that sense, they achieved a kind of immortality, not the noble standing they sought, but perhaps something more valuable, a lasting contribution to American culture. Chapter 8. The Journalists' Attack. The wealthy thought they controlled their image. They owned newspapers. They sponsored charities. They built libraries and museums with their names on them. They assumed public thanks for their generosity. Then the investigative journalists arrived and everything changed. The term muckraker came from Theodore Roosevelt. He borrowed it from a book referring to a character who raked muck instead of looking up to heaven. Roosevelt meant it as a criticism. These journalists focused on society's filth rather than its progress. They exposed corruption instead of celebrating success. The journalists took it as a compliment. Yes, they raked muck because American society had a lot of muck that needed raking. The movement began in the magazines. McClure's magazine led the way. Started in 1893 by S.S. McClure, it published serious investigative reporting alongside fiction and general interest articles. McClure understood something crucial. Middle-class Americans wanted to understand the forces shaping their world. They sensed something was wrong with how wealth and power operated. They just needed someone to explain it clearly. In 1902, McClure's published 3 groundbreaking series at the same time. Lincoln Steffens exposed city political corruption in The Shame of the Cities. Ray Stannard Baker investigated labor conditions and racial inequality. And Ida Tarbell began her devastating series on Standard Oil. Tarbell's work hit the hardest. She spent years researching John D. Rockefeller's business methods. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees. She obtained private documents. She traced the company's history from its start through its rise to monopoly power. What she revealed shocked readers. Rockefeller hadn't built Standard Oil through better products or service. He had used ruthless tactics, secret deals with railroads for special shipping rates, charging lower prices than competitors to drive them out of business, industrial spying, bribery, and threats. The company systematically destroyed anyone who challenged it. Tarbell wrote with precision and restraint. She didn't need sensationalism. The facts were damaging enough. She showed how Rockefeller's monopoly raised prices for consumers while crushing small businesses, how the trust concentrated wealth while creating poverty, how one man's fortune came at a huge cost to thousands of others. The series ran from 1902 to 1904. It was published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which became a bestseller. Suddenly, Rockefeller was not a captain of industry. He was a robber baron. His wealth was not an admirable success. It was stolen goods. Rockefeller tried defending himself. He pointed to his charity, the libraries, the universities, the medical research. Shouldn't his good works count for something? The public wasn't buying it. As one critic put it, Rockefeller was giving away with one hand what he had stolen with the other. The charity did not erase the methods used to acquire the fortune. Blood money remained blood money, even when donated to good causes. Other journalists followed Tarbell's example. Upton Sinclair investigated the meatpacking industry. His novel, The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed horrific conditions in Chicago stockyards, spoiled meat sold to consumers, workers losing fingers in machinery, rats falling into sausage grinders. The public was horrified. President Roosevelt, after reading it, invited Sinclair to the White House and ordered investigations. Sinclair had actually intended to highlight worker exploitation, the dangerous conditions, the poverty wages, the lack of rights. But readers focused on the contaminated food. As Sinclair later said, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Still, the book achieved results. The Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906, were a direct result of The Jungle's impact. David Graham Phillips attacked political corruption. His series, The Treason of the Senate, published in 1906, showed how wealthy industrialists controlled senators through bribery and influence. The Senate was supposed to represent the people. Instead, it served corporate interests. Phillips named names, documented payments, and showed the corruption mechanisms clearly. The attacks extended to specific industries and individuals. Thomas Lawson, a former stockbroker, wrote Frenzied Finance, exposing stock manipulation schemes. Charles Edward Russell investigated the Beef Trust. Ray Stannard Baker wrote about railroad monopolies. Every major industry came under scrutiny. The magazines that published these exposures saw their circulation soar. McClure's reached hundreds of thousands of readers. Collier's Weekly, Everybody's Magazine, The American Magazine all published this journalism. They discovered that exposing corruption sold copies. Readers were hungry for this information. The wealthy fought back. They pressured advertisers to boycott the magazines. They bought newspapers to counter the narratives. They hired public relations firms, a new industry, to improve their images. John D. Rockefeller Jr., trying to restore his father's reputation, hired Ivy Lee, one of America's first PR professionals. Lee advised a softer approach. Show Rockefeller as human. Photograph him giving dimes to children. Emphasize his religious faith. Focus on philanthropy. Don't directly address the criticisms. Just flood the zone with positive stories until the negative ones faded. It partially worked. Rockefeller's image improved somewhat, but the fundamental damage remained. The journalists had shown that great fortunes were built on exploitation. The public couldn't unlearn that. The investigations also led to concrete reforms. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. Each addressed problems the journalists had exposed. The reporting had real impact. It changed laws. It changed how Americans viewed wealth. For the Gilded Age elite, this was devastating. They had assumed their wealth gave them authority, that their success proved they deserved power. The journalists challenged that assumption directly. They showed that wealth often came from exploitation, not talent. That monopoly power came from corruption, not efficiency. The psychological impact was significant. The wealthy had believed their own stories. They genuinely thought they were benefactors, job creators, and nation builders. The journalists reframed them as predators, thieves, and oppressors. That reframing was hard to shake. Public opinion shifted dramatically. In 1880, most Americans admired wealthy industrialists. By 1910, many viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. The change wasn't universal. Some still defended the robber barons, but the consensus had cracked. Wealth no longer automatically commanded respect. This made the social system harder to maintain. When Mrs. Astor threw elaborate balls, newspapers had once covered them admiringly. By the early 1900s, coverage turned critical. Why were the wealthy spending fortunes on parties when workers starved? The same actions that once seemed glamorous now seemed obscene. The journalists also inspired a generation. Young people read these exposures and decided to fight for reform. Future progressives, labor leaders, and politicians traced their awakening to this kind of reporting. The articles provided education. They showed how power actually worked. They revealed that change was possible. By 1912, the muckraking era was waning. Magazines faced economic pressure. Advertisers withdrew support. Some publications folded. Others softened their criticism. The peak moment of exposure had passed. But the damage from the wealthy's perspective was permanent. The journalists had destroyed the moral authority of Gilded Age fortunes. They had shown that wealth came from exploitation, that monopolies harmed the public, that the system was rigged. You couldn't go back from that knowledge. Once Americans understood how their society actually worked, they couldn't pretend otherwise. And that understanding created demand for change. Real change. The kind that would eventually dismantle the Gilded Age entirely. The journalists didn't destroy the Gilded Age alone, but they provided the intellectual ammunition. They gave reformers the facts they needed. They turned public opinion against unchecked wealth. They made continued excess politically impossible, and the wealthy never forgave them for it. Chapter 9. Labor Revolts and the 1913 Tax. The workers had been patient. Decades of patience, accepting low wages, enduring dangerous conditions, watching fortunes pile up at the top while they struggled to feed their families. But patience has limits. By the 1890s, those limits had been reached. Across America, workers began fighting back not with words but with strikes, work stoppages, and confrontations that sometimes turned violent. The Gilded Age elite discovered that their wealth depended on workers who had decided they had had enough. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 set the pattern. It started in West Virginia when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages. Workers walked off. The strike spread along rail lines to Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then across the country. Within weeks, tens of thousands of workers had stopped working. The railroads brought in replacement workers. The strikers fought them. Violence erupted in multiple cities. In Pittsburgh, soldiers fired into crowds, killing 20 people. Rioters burned railroad property in response. Millions of dollars in damage. The strike lasted 45 days before federal troops restored order. The 1880s brought more conflicts. In 1886, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago shocked the nation. Workers were striking for an 8-hour workday. During a peaceful rally, someone threw a bomb at police. 7 officers died. Police opened fire on the crowd. 4 workers died. 8 anarchists were arrested and tried. 4 were hanged, though evidence connecting them to the bombing was thin. The Haymarket Affair terrified the wealthy. If workers were willing to use bombs, nowhere was safe. The Fifth Avenue mansions, the Newport summer homes, the private railroad cars, all could be targets. Security increased. Guards were hired. Paranoia set in. The strikes continued. Steel workers, coal miners, textile workers. Nearly every major industry experienced labor unrest. The pattern was consistent. Workers demanded better wages or conditions. Management refused. Workers struck. Management brought in replacement workers. Violence often followed. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was particularly brutal. It occurred at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania. Workers struck over wage cuts. Henry Clay Frick, managing the plant, hired 300 Pinkerton detectives as private security. The Pinkertons arrived by barge. Armed workers met them at the dock. A 12-hour gun battle followed. 10 people died. Dozens were wounded. The state militia eventually broke the strike. The workers lost. The union was destroyed. But Carnegie's reputation suffered permanent damage. He had been in Scotland during the strike, claiming he didn't know about Frick's tactics. No one believed him. The man who preached about the gospel of wealth had ordered armed guards to shoot striking workers. The Pullman strike of 1894 showed labor's growing organization. When the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages without reducing rents in company housing, workers struck. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported them by refusing to handle Pullman cars. The boycott paralyzed rail traffic nationwide. President Cleveland intervened. He sent federal troops to break the strike, claiming mail delivery was disrupted. Soldiers forced trains through. Debs was arrested. The strike collapsed, but it demonstrated that workers could organize across industries. That scared the wealthy more than isolated strikes ever had. Each strike brought the same response from management. Refuse to negotiate. Hire replacements. Use violence if necessary. The wealthy saw compromise as weakness. If you gave in to one group of workers, others would make demands. Better to crush them all. But the strikes revealed something important. The Gilded Age depended on cheap labor. The mansions required dozens of underpaid houseworkers. The factories needed workers willing to accept poverty wages. The railroads couldn't run without engineers and conductors working long hours for little pay. If those workers refused, the whole system stopped. This gave labor unexpected power. Not enough to win most strikes. Management usually prevailed, but enough to make the wealthy nervous. Enough to show that their control wasn't absolute, that their fortunes depended on continued cooperation from people they had exploited. Public opinion was shifting too. Middle-class Americans, who might once have sided with management, began sympathizing with strikers. The journalists' exposures had shown the exploitation. People understood why workers were angry. When soldiers shot striking workers, it looked like wealthy men using state power to protect profits. This created political pressure for reform. If violent strikes were the alternative, maybe small concessions made sense. Progressive politicians began pushing labor reforms, limits on working hours, safety regulations, the right to form unions. Nothing radical, but movement in labor's direction. The wealthy resisted all of it. They argued that business couldn't survive with regulations, that free markets required complete freedom. that workers were free to quit if they didn't like conditions. Government interference would destroy American prosperity. But they were losing the argument. Too many people had seen the alternative. Unrestricted capitalism had created obscene inequality. Workers weren't free to quit when quitting meant starvation. The market wasn't working for most Americans. Something had to change. The biggest change came in 1913. Congress passed the 16th Amendment, creating a federal income tax. For the first time, the government could tax wealth directly. The wealthy had fought this for decades. Previous attempts at income taxes had been struck down as unconstitutional. But the progressive movement finally forced it through. The amendment was approved in February 1913. By October, the first income tax law was in effect. The initial rates were modest, 1% on income over $3,000, up to 7% on income over $500,000. The wealthy could afford it easily, but the principle terrified them. If the government could tax income, it could tax wealth. The power to tax was the power to destroy, and the rates would only rise. Within a few years, as World War I required massive government spending, top rates climbed dramatically. By 1918, the highest bracket paid 77%. The days of accumulating unlimited, untaxed wealth were over. The income tax changed the economics of everything. Building a mansion became less attractive when you couldn't keep as much of your earnings. Employing 50 houseworkers made less sense when their payroll wasn't deductible against lower net income. Throwing $100,000 parties felt wasteful when taxes claimed most of your profits. The wealthy adapted. They hired accountants to find deductions. They established trusts to shelter money. They moved assets offshore. Tax avoidance became an industry. But they couldn't avoid taxation entirely. The government was taking a cut. That was permanent. Inheritance taxes followed. The government taxed estates when wealth passed to heirs. This prevented fortunes from accumulating across generations. Each generation paid taxes. Over time, this eroded even the largest fortunes. The combination was devastating to Gilded Age economics. Labor unrest made businesses less profitable. Income taxes claimed much of what remained. Inheritance taxes prevented passing full fortunes to children. The system that had created massive wealth concentration was being dismantled piece by piece. By 1915, the landscape had shifted. Workers were organized. Strikes were common. Progressive reforms were passing. Taxes were climbing. The wealthy still had enormous resources. But the direction was clear. Their position was weakening. The Golden Age was ending. And then came the war. World War I would accelerate everything: the labor shortages, the taxes, the social changes. The conflict would reshape American society so thoroughly that the Gilded Age would never return. Even if the wealthy wanted to restore it, the world that had made it possible was gone. Chapter 10. World War I shatters the illusion. In August 1914, Europe exploded into war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany invaded Belgium. France entered. Britain followed. Within weeks, the continent was engulfed in the largest conflict in human history. America stayed out. President Wilson declared neutrality. The war was Europe's problem. Let them fight. America would continue business as usual. But the conflict changed everything anyway. Even from across the Atlantic, World War I destroyed the world that had created the Gilded Age. And it did so in ways no one anticipated. First, it killed European aristocracy. Literally. Young British lords enlisted as officers and died in the trenches. French nobility lost sons at Verdun. German princes fell at the Somme. The officer class came disproportionately from aristocratic families. They led from the front. They died in enormous numbers. The statistics were staggering. Britain lost nearly 750,000 men. An entire generation, the noble class, was devastated. Estates passed to distant relatives. Ancient family lines ended. The social structure that had survived centuries collapsed in 4 years, and that aristocracy had been the model American millionaires aspired to. The Fifth Avenue mansions were built to resemble European palaces. The elaborate social rituals mimicked European courts. American daughters married British lords to gain titles. The whole system depended on European aristocracy being worth imitating. Now that aristocracy was dying in Belgian mud, The sons of dukes lived in trenches infested with rats. Viscounts commanded men in gas attacks. Earls died anonymously in mass graves. The glamour, the romance, the centuries of refinement. None of it protected them from machine guns and artillery. American elites watched and absorbed the lesson. Titles meant nothing when shells were falling. Lineage didn't stop bullets. The European aristocracy they had envied was revealed as vulnerable, mortal, not superior beings, just privileged people who happened to be born into the right families. The war also demonstrated that governments could do things previously considered impossible. Total mobilization, rationing, price controls, massive taxation, draft armies, command economies. The hands-off capitalism that had created Gilded Age fortunes was suspended. National survival required government control. And it worked. France, Britain, and eventually America reorganized their entire economies for military production. Governments directed labor, allocated resources, and controlled prices. The invisible hand of the market was replaced by the visible hand of state planning. And societies didn't collapse. They adapted. This shattered ideological certainty. If governments could run economies during war, why couldn't they regulate them during peace? If taxation could be increased dramatically to fund military spending, why couldn't it stay high to fund social programs? The war proved government intervention could work. That undermined every argument for unlimited capitalism. When America entered the conflict in April 1917, the changes accelerated. The government needed money. Income tax rates soared. The top bracket reached 77% by 1918. Revenue from income taxes increased from roughly $37 million in 1914 to nearly $1 billion in 1918. The government also needed labor. Women entered factories by the millions, taking jobs previously reserved for men. They proved they could do the work. They gained economic independence. They discovered they didn't need husbands or fathers controlling their income. When the war ended, many refused to return to previous subservience. This transformation affected domestic workers dramatically. Young women who had been maids discovered they could earn more in munitions factories. The work was dangerous but paid better than service. And crucially, when the shift ended, they were done. They could go home, have privacy, and live their own lives. After tasting that freedom, returning to being a houseworker felt intolerable. The shortage of household help accelerated quickly. Families who had easily employed 30 or 40 people before the conflict struggled to find 10. Wages for domestic positions increased, but still couldn't compete with factory pay and freedom. The servant crisis that had been developing for years became severe. This made the mansions increasingly unlivable. A 50-room palace required substantial staff just for basic maintenance. Without that, the houses deteriorated. Rooms went unused. Standards declined. Families rattled around in enormous buildings they couldn't properly maintain. The conflict also changed American attitudes toward wealth display. When young men were dying in France, throwing elaborate parties felt obscene. The government encouraged restraint. Resources needed to go toward supporting troops. Conspicuous consumption seemed unpatriotic. Society continued but subdued. Balls became smaller. Guest lists shortened. Menus simplified. Not from legal requirements, but from social pressure. Excess became embarrassing rather than impressive. The values that had driven Gilded Age competition, who could throw the most elaborate party, build the largest mansion, own the most extensive jewels, suddenly seemed trivial. The psychological shift was profound. A generation of young people came of age during the conflict. They saw aristocracy die. They saw governments control economies successfully. They saw women prove their capabilities. They saw wealth displays condemned as wasteful. When the fighting ended, they didn't want to return to the old system. They wanted something different. Veterans especially rejected pre-war values. They had seen horrors, lost friends, and witnessed industrial slaughter. Coming home to find wealthy families still living in palaces while workers struggled felt wrong. Many veterans became radicalized. Some joined labor movements. Others supported socialist candidates. They had fought for democracy abroad and wanted it enforced at home. The Russian Revolution of 1917 terrified American elites. The Tsar overthrown, aristocracy murdered, property seized, communists in power. If it could happen in Russia, couldn't it happen here? The parallels were obvious: extreme inequality. Wealthy elites out of touch with common people. Workers pushed to breaking points. Russia had exploded. America might be next. This fear pushed some wealthy families toward modest reform. Better to accept higher taxes and some regulation than risk revolution. Better to tone down the showiness than provoke the masses. Self-preservation required adaptation, but others reacted defensively. They blamed outside agitators. They claimed labor unrest was caused by communist infiltrators, not genuine grievances. They supported crackdowns on radicals. They fought every reform. This resistance would continue through the 1920s, but it was a losing battle. The momentum had shifted. The conflict also disrupted the transatlantic cultural flow. Americans had been buying European treasures for decades. The fighting made that impossible. European families had more urgent concerns than selling paintings. Art markets froze. Americans who had been building collections found sources dried up. More importantly, the relationship changed. America had been the upstart, buying culture from refined Europe. But America emerged from the conflict as a creditor nation. European countries owed America billions. The power dynamic had reversed. Americans didn't need to feel inferior anymore. They had saved Europe. That earned respect. When the armistice came in November 1918, America was transformed. Politically more progressive, socially more equal, economically more regulated. Women had voted in some states and were pushing for national suffrage. Labor unions were stronger. Government was larger. Taxes were higher. The world of 1870, when Gilded Age fortunes began accumulating, was gone. The assumptions that supported unlimited wealth concentration had been shattered. Government could intervene in economies. Aristocracy wasn't inherently superior. Women could work and vote. Workers could organize. Extreme inequality was dangerous. The wealthy families who had built Fifth Avenue palaces found themselves in a changed country. Their mansions seemed out of date. Their lifestyle seemed outdated. Their values seemed archaic. They could continue living as before, but only by ignoring reality. The foundation had cracked. The structure was unstable, and soon it would start coming down. Chapter 11. When the heirs couldn't afford it, Cornelius Vanderbilt III inherited his grandmother Alice's mansion in 1926. He didn't want it. The house at 5th Avenue and 57th Street was magnificent, 130 rooms, an entire city block, the largest private residence in Manhattan. It had cost over $3 million to build in 1882. It represented the peak of Gilded Age ambition. It also cost $30,000 annually in property taxes alone. Add heating, electricity, basic maintenance and insurance, and carrying costs exceeded $100,000 yearly. To actually live there meant employing at least 30 staff members. That added another $100,000 or more in wages. Cornelius III was wealthy by any normal standard, but he couldn't afford that house. Nobody could. Not anymore. The economics had fundamentally changed. His grandfather, Cornelius II, had lived during an era of no income tax. Every dollar earned was kept. Accumulating wealth was straightforward. Make money, keep money, buy property. By 1926, the top income tax bracket was 25%. It had been 77% during the recent conflict and would rise again. But even at 25%, it meant giving a quarter of your income to the government before paying any other expenses. Inheritance taxes made the problem worse. When Cornelius II died, his fortune passed with minimal taxation. By the 1920s, estate taxes claimed significant portions of inherited wealth. The money that funded the mansion's construction couldn't be replicated by heirs facing modern taxation. The servant situation was equally impossible. Before the conflict, finding qualified household help was easy. Young immigrants needed work. Domestic positions, while poorly paid, offered employment. But post-conflict opportunities had expanded. Factories paid better. Retail positions offered more freedom. Fewer people were willing to work as live-in help. Those still willing to serve demanded higher wages. The imbalance of supply and demand worked in their favor. If you wanted a butler, a housekeeper, and adequate staff, you paid premium rates and still struggled to fill positions. The math didn't work. To maintain a Fifth Avenue palace required perhaps $250,000 annually. To generate that after taxes required earning considerably more. You needed an enormous fortune producing substantial income. And even then, most of that fortune would go toward maintaining one house. Cornelius III looked at the numbers and made a rational decision. Sell, The house went to Bergdorf Goodman for $7 million. They wanted the land, not the building. Within months, the mansion was demolished. He wasn't alone. Up and down Fifth Avenue, similar calculations were happening. Andrew Carnegie's widow sold his mansion in 1926. The house was barely 27 years old. It had been built to last centuries. It lasted less than 3 decades. The Astor mansions came down. The Havemeyer house was demolished. The Senator Clark Palace, which had cost $7 million and taken 7 years to build, was torn down in 1927. One by one, the monuments to Gilded Age waste disappeared. The families selling weren't broke. Many remained wealthy. But wealth wasn't enough. You needed extraordinary resources to maintain these palaces. And increasingly, the resources required exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. Some tried adapting. They closed off floors, lived in just a few rooms, and reduced staff to bare minimums. But living in a 50-room mansion with 5 staff members meant the house deteriorated. Rooms went unheated. Leaks weren't repaired. Standards declined. The buildings required full staffing or they fell apart. Others tried converting mansions to other uses, turning them into apartments, offices, or clubs. But the buildings weren't designed for conversion. The rooms were too large, the layouts too specific. Electrical and plumbing systems were outdated. Converting cost more than demolishing and building new. The land values made demolition inevitable anyway. A Fifth Avenue lot was worth millions, but only if you could build something profitable on it. A mansion housing one family generated no income. An apartment building housing dozens of families, or a commercial building with shops and offices generated substantial revenue. The financial logic was overwhelming. Sell the land, demolish the mansion, build something modern. Developers paid premium prices because they knew they could make money. The families accepted because keeping the houses meant slowly going broke. The emotional cost was significant. These weren't just buildings. They were family homes, places where children had grown up, where weddings had happened, where parents and grandparents had lived. Selling meant admitting that era was over, that the family's glory days had passed. Some descendants fought to keep houses. They borrowed money, deferred maintenance, and struggled on, but most eventually surrendered. The economics were inescapable. You couldn't maintain Gilded Age mansions on post-Gilded Age incomes. The demolitions happened quickly once they started. Wrecking crews could tear down a mansion in weeks. The limestone fronts that had taken years to carve were smashed to rubble. The ornate interiors were gutted. Some architectural elements were saved and sold to collectors or museums. Most went to landfills. Photographs from the era show the surreal sight of these palaces being destroyed. Walls knocked down, roofs collapsed, elegant fronts with gaping holes. The contrast between the building's grandeur and their violent demolition was stark. What took years to build took days to destroy. New York wasn't alone. Similar patterns played out in other cities. The Chicago mansions came down. The Philadelphia estates were sold. Newport's summer homes fared slightly better because they were vacation homes, not year-round residences. But even there, many were demolished or fell into neglect. The speed of the transformation shocked observers. In 1890, Fifth Avenue was lined with mansions. By 1930, most were gone. 40 years from construction to demolition. Buildings designed to last centuries didn't survive half that. What replaced them told its own story. Department stores, office buildings, apartment houses, commercial enterprises open to anyone with money to spend. The exclusive residential district became mixed use. Public access replaced private privilege. The physical landscape reflected changed social values. A few mansions survived. Henry Clay Frick's house became a museum as he had planned. His widow lived there until 1931. Then the Frick collection opened to the public. It remains today one of the world's great small museums. Andrew Carnegie's mansion survived longer than most before finally being demolished in 1940. By then, it had been unused for over a decade. Nobody wanted to buy it. Nobody could maintain it. Eventually, the land was too valuable to leave vacant. The survivors were exceptions. The Cooper Hewitt Museum now occupies a different Carnegie house on 91st Street that was converted rather than demolished. The Museum of the City of New York occupies what was once a mansion. A handful of others became clubs or institutions, but the vast majority are gone. Where the Vanderbilt mansion stood is now Bergdorf Goodman. Where the Astor houses were is now commercial real estate. The physical evidence of the Gilded Age mostly disappeared. The buildings that announced wealth so loudly were silenced. The demolitions represented more than architectural loss. They marked the end of an economic system, the end of a social structure, the end of an era when unlimited wealth accumulation was possible and maintaining private palaces was feasible. The heirs weren't failures. They simply lived in different times. Times with higher taxes, higher costs, different values. Times when spending $250,000 annually on one house seemed wasteful rather than admirable. Times when economic realities made such spending impossible even for the wealthy. The Gilded Age had built its monuments, and then economic and social changes made those monuments unsustainable. The mansions came down not because of disaster or deliberate destruction, but because nobody could afford to keep them standing. Chapter 12. Wrecking Balls and What Survived. The 1920s and 30s transformed Fifth Avenue beyond recognition. Where French castles had stood, Art Deco towers rose. Where private palaces had occupied entire blocks, apartment buildings housed hundreds of families. The street that had symbolized Gilded Age excess became a commercial area. The architectural style of what replaced the mansions tells its own story. Art Deco was modern. Clean lines, geometric patterns, no historical pretense. These buildings didn't try to look like European palaces. They announced themselves as thoroughly American and contemporary, the future, not the past. Bergdorf Goodman's new building on the Vanderbilt site opened in 1928. Elegant, but commercial. Anyone with money could enter. No social credentials required. No calling cards, no introductions. Just walk in and shop. The democratization was complete. Where society's 400 once gathered, thousands now browsed. The apartments that replaced other mansions followed similar patterns. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue, completed in 1930, housed wealthy families. But instead of one family per block, dozens lived in the same building. They shared an address, shared lobbies, and shared staff. The extreme isolation of the Gilded Age mansion was gone. These apartments were luxurious. Large rooms, high ceilings, fine details, but they were still apartments. You didn't employ 30 personal staff. The building provided doorman, maintenance, and cleaning. Services were professionalized and shared, more efficient, less wasteful, more suited to the times. The economic logic was inescapable. An apartment building generated income for owners while providing housing efficiency for residents. The land was used productively. Taxes could be covered by rental income. The buildings sustained themselves financially in ways single-family mansions never could. But not everything was demolished. A few Gilded Age structures survived by changing their purpose. They became museums, clubs, schools, or cultural institutions. Survival required public access. Private palaces became public resources. The Frick Collection opened in 1935. Henry Clay Frick had planned this. His mansion was designed to eventually house his art. When his widow died in 1931, the house and collection transferred to a trust. Renovations adapted the building for museum use. It opened to visitors who once would never have been admitted. Walking through the Frick today feels like visiting a Gilded Age mansion frozen in time. The paintings Frick collected still hang. The furniture remains. The rooms are arranged much as they were when he lived there, except now anyone can visit. Pay admission and you enter a world that was once completely private. The Morgan Library followed a similar path. J.P. Morgan's personal library became a museum after his son donated it to the public in 1924. The building was expanded, but kept its original character. The rare books, manuscripts, and artworks Morgan collected are now available to scholars and visitors. These institutions preserved not just buildings, but entire collections. The art the robber barons accumulated didn't vanish. It was made accessible. In an ironic way, their fortunes ended up serving the public good they had often ignored while alive. Other mansions became clubs. The University Club, the Metropolitan Club. Private organizations bought the buildings and adapted them. Members rather than single families now use the grand rooms, still exclusive but serving broader purposes than one household. Some became schools or cultural centers. The building that now houses the Museum of the City of New York started as a private residence. The Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum occupies Andrew Carnegie's mansion on 91st Street. The buildings found new life by serving educational purposes, but these survivors were exceptions. For every mansion that was repurposed, 10 were demolished. The majority of Gilded Age architecture simply vanished. Block after block that had been residential became commercial. The physical transformation mirrored the social one. Newport's preservation happened differently. The Rhode Island summer homes survived because they were vacation homes, not primary residences. The carrying costs, while substantial, were manageable for wealthy families who used them seasonally. And eventually many were donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County. Today, tourists visit the Breakers Marble House and other Newport mansions. They walk through rooms that once hosted society balls. They see the luxury firsthand. The houses function as museums, teaching visitors about an era that ended a century ago. The preservation movement itself emerged partly from watching the Fifth Avenue demolitions. As mansion after mansion disappeared, some recognized that architectural history was being lost. Organizations formed to save significant buildings. Historic preservation laws were passed, but too late for most Gilded Age structures. What survived in New York were mostly buildings that had institutional backing, museums, libraries, clubs, and organizations with resources to maintain structures and compelling reasons to keep them. Individual families couldn't sustain palaces, but institutions with endowments and public support could. The demolished mansions left almost nothing behind. Some architectural elements were saved: doors, fireplaces, paneling. They ended up in museums or other buildings, but the structures themselves vanished completely. In many cases, even photographs are scarce. The buildings existed for such short periods that documentation is limited. This erasure was remarkably thorough. A visitor to Fifth Avenue today sees almost no evidence of the Gilded Age. The buildings are gone. The families who built them are footnotes in history. The social system that sustained it all has vanished. Only the stories remain. The Art Deco buildings that replaced the mansions are themselves now historic. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center. These structures from the 1920s and 30s define New York's skyline. They represent a different set of values: corporate power rather than individual wealth, modernism rather than historical imitation, commerce rather than exclusivity. In a sense, the replacement buildings are more democratic. Thousands of people work in an office tower. One family lived in a mansion. The land serves more people. The architecture is more efficient. The social impact is broader. By those measures, the change was progress. But something was lost too. The craftsmanship, the materials, the sheer ambition of building a private palace in a modern city. The Gilded Age mansions were excessive, wasteful, and monuments to inequality. They were also artistic achievements. The labor and skill that went into them can't be replicated. Modern economics makes such buildings impossible. Even billionaires today don't build 100-room urban palaces. Costs are too high. Staff is unavailable. Taxes are prohibitive. The social climate condemns such display. The combination of economic and cultural factors that made Gilded Age mansions possible no longer exists. So what we're left with are the exceptions: the Frick, the Morgan Library, the Newport Summer Homes, windows into a vanished world, carefully preserved examples of an era that ended a century ago. They let us see how the wealthy once lived, and they remind us that nothing, no matter how solid it seems, is permanent. The Gilded Age built its monuments. Then economic forces, social changes, and shifting values destroyed most of them. The wrecking balls that demolished Vanderbilt mansions in the 1920s demolished more than buildings. They demolished a social system, an economic structure, a way of life that had seemed unshakable but proved remarkably fragile. What survived did so by transforming, by opening to the public, by serving broader purposes. The private palaces that became public institutions endured. The ones that remained exclusively private vanished. That might be the final lesson. Wealth that serves only itself doesn't last. Fortunes that benefit only their owners get dispersed. Buildings that house only one family get demolished. But resources dedicated to public benefit can endure. The art collections, the libraries, the museums, these legacies outlasted the fortunes that created them. The age ended. Its mansions fell. Its social system collapsed. But transformed into institutions serving everyone, some of what it created survives. Not as monuments to wealth, but as resources for learning. Not as private luxury, but as shared heritage. The age ended, but pieces of it, repurposed and democratized, remain.